this season finale of Plants of the Gods. Join Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with Peter Grinspoon, MD, cannabis specialist at Harvard Medical School. During this conversation, Dr. Plotkin and Dr. Grinspoon discuss everything from the pain-relieving and uplifting qualities of cannabis sought by people with chronic illnesses to marijuana in popular culture, and much more.
Welcome to Plants of the Gods. We have a special guest today, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, who's not only one of the most important figures in the field, but is perhaps the only person in the field of psychedelic research and medicine who is second generation, because his father, Lester Grinspoon, was a pioneer. And I want to get into a little bit of that before we dive deeply into Peter's new and fantastic book that I'm encouraging everybody not only to buy and read, but to buy 2 copies and give one to somebody else in your life who should be reading it as well. Now, when we talk about hallucinogens and mind-altering substances at Harvard, most people in the general public associate it, unfortunately, with Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. People in the ethnobotanical community, where I come from, associate it with Richard Schultes and Gordon Wasson. But the actual fact of the matter is that it began with William James, the father of psychology, who experimented with laughing gas and other mind-altering substances. Now, Richard Schultes is known somewhat to the general public. I would say that Peter's father, Lester Grinspoon, is much less known to the general public, which he should be, because he was truly a pioneer on many levels. Many of his classic books, like the 2 that he did on marijuana, are still readable today. The first one was Marijuana Reconsidered, Peter, is that correct?
Yep, in 1971, he had Marijuana Reconsidered.
And then the second one?
In 1993, he had Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine.
Okay. And Andrew Weil, who's another founding father, a founding figure in the psychedelic and mind-altering substances movement, said that Peter's new book, Seeing Through the Smoke, is part of a trilogy, with his father writing the first 2 books and Peter writing the third. So, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, welcome to Plants of the Gods.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I think you have a unique perspective, not just because of the familial reasons, but because of the fact that you are a physician, because of the fact that, according to your book, you've actually smoked marijuana, and that you have done very serious research and experiences and experiments around the world. And I have to say, I think you're the only person that I know of on the Harvard Medical School staff who smoked cannabis with the Grateful Dead and in a remote park in Rhodesia. So I'd like you to compare and contrast those 2 experiences and perhaps give the origin stories to both.
Well, Rhodesia, my brother David is an astrobiologist. He's a great guy. He's a writer. He's written like 4 books. He's really just cool, smart person. And he had a graduate student friend from Rhodesia who invited us to visit. So in 1990, right, just about 10 years after the revolution, it was really a spectacular time in, I guess now Zimbabwe. It had become Rhodesia to Zimbabwe is right after the revolution. And it was really a time of like peace and plenty in Zimbabwe. It was Mugabe was the president, but it was really interesting. Mugabe was still seemingly, a benevolent leader, not a like insane dictator. So we were in Rhodesia at a time, and we were in the most far-flung parts of Rhodesia, just because, when you visit a place with someone who who lives there is very different than just visiting as a tourist. So we had very close friends, David's buddy from graduate school, where they studied astrobiology. So we definitely were smoking cannabis in some of the most rural parts of Zimbabwe. And it was just really, what a great way to facilitate like community and connection and share stories. And my brother David like very quickly picked up the guitar, sort of the way to play guitar, and he was jamming with all these different bands. And we just had a great experience. And, that was during the time when I had a little bit of an unusual background. I studied philosophy with a minor in religion and sociology at Swarthmore College. And then I spent 5 years working at Greenpeace, working on the anti-nuclear campaign and the clean energy campaign before medical school. So I have a pretty deep background in advocacy and in activism. Apart from the fact that I grew up in my family where everybody was getting arrested at the Nevada test site, with Carl Sagan or whatever, protesting nuclear weapons. But I had my own 5 years of training at Greenpeace and advocacy. And you got to meet the most interesting people. Like on the rooftop, there'd be the Grateful Dead, like at a party, the executive directors, because they were big supporters, passing joints around. So I do feel like in my cannabis days, they've been very broad and deep. I've had a lot of different cultural experiences. And, what you learn over the years and what I learned growing up in my household is that the truth about cannabis isn't how it's been portrayed by the DARE program or by the war on drugs. The truth is very different. Cannabis can have great harms. It can have great benefits. It helps people. It helps people medically. It helps people sort of with their lifestyle, with their creativity, with their connection to other people, with their ability to be sort of mindfully habitate the present. So I got a much broader slice or view or education about cannabis than a typical teenager, young adult growing up might get if you just listen to what we're taught and what we're told, which is, with all psychedelic drugs have very little to do with the actual reality of the actual drugs or medicines because of the war on drugs.
Well, I was once told early on that marijuana was a gateway drug to other drugs. And I replied by saying, well, isn't Gerber baby food?
Exactly. Yeah. You're absolutely right. All people who become addicted to heroin drink milk as a child. And, the drug war talking point, we're like, aha, things are associated, but association doesn't prove causation. And obviously all the young babies eating Gerber baby food or drinking milk, that's not causing the addiction later in life. They're just associated. So that was a big nothing burger of the drug war that cannabis led to or caused other drugs. First of all, it was more the alcohol and the tobacco. And second of all, there wasn't a causal relationship. There was just an association. But, I'm happy to talk at any point about the way in which cannabis is proving to be a gateway off of addiction for millions of people who are addicted to many other drugs that are more dangerous. I mean, we're viewing cannabis, yes, as a gateway, but not as a gateway onto drugs, onto heroin or cocaine like they used in the drug war, but more as a gateway off of other drugs, as a harm reduction technique, because cannabis can help with a lot of the distress that people are feeling that fuels the addiction in the first place and can, for many people, offer a less toxic alternative to many of these more dangerous drugs that people unfortunately get stuck on.
Well, this is what I like so much about your book. You have a chapter on these key themes, cannabis and addiction, cannabis and driving, cannabis and pregnancy. And that's why I thought it's such a special piece of work, because it's sort of an autobiography, and it's sort of a clinical study, and it's sort of a philosophical rumination. And I can't think of many books that fit that genre. You may own that yourself.
Well, I had good role models growing up. I mean, my dad's two best friends were John Mack, the psychiatrist who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing a psychoanalytic biography of Lawrence of Arabia, and his other best friend was Carl Sagan, who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing Dragons of Eden. And the thing about my dad is that he was a great writer. Everybody knows him for his sort of fearless positions and articulate advocacy, but he was actually a very masterful writer as well. So writing was always, and then my brother David, who I love and admire, is a great writer. So writing was always to me, the highest art form. And I had always just been very, very eager to work in my writing. And I just, to me, admire writers more than anybody. So I put a lot of effort into it. Thank you for saying that. But it's really important to me, my writing.
Well, another important scientific writer is Andrew Weil, also another graduate of Harvard Medical School, also a former student of Richard Schultes. And Andrew Weil tells a story in the foreword to Seeing Through the Smoke of your father setting out to do a study or write a paper showing why marijuana was so addictive and dangerous, and coming to the opposite conclusion.
Right. Well, his original article was in Scientific American in 1969. There's actually a cool picture of Jerry Garcia holding that episode or that issue. But he started out with the whole cannabis stuff. He was ensconced in the Harvard psychiatric community. And honestly, the psychiatrists back then, with the exceptions of, a few that can really think for themselves, like my dad and Norman Zinberg, there was very little daylight between what the psychiatrists believed and said about cannabis and other drugs for that matter, and what the US government said. There just wasn't any separation. There was very little independent thought. And so my dad, being sort of a consequence of his time, really said, what are these crazy kids doing smoking all this marijuana? This is dangerous. They're hurting themselves. So he did a very, very deep dive starting in the late 1960s. And this is what culminated in his book in 1971, Marijuana Reconsidered. And when he looked at the literature deeply on his own, he realized that, sure, there are harms to cannabis. There are harms to any medication that we use. And he was worried about pregnancy. He was worried about teen usage, sort of the same things we're worried about today. But what he came to realize is that many of the harms had been vastly exaggerated. Many of the benefits had been not studied, ignored, papered over, or just lied about. And that the real harm of cannabis was criminalizing it, and that having interaction with the criminal justice system was so much more harmful than actually using cannabis, which again was not harmless, but much less harmful than interacting with the criminal justice system. So he ended up calling for legalization for adults, not for everybody, age 21 or something like that, in 1971, which was pretty brave because back then only 12% of Americans supported full legalization. It went up about a point for each of the 50 years he worked on it until he passed away about 2 years ago. So now it's about 69%, including more than half of Republicans support full legalization of medical cannabis. And now 94% of Americans support legal access to medical cannabis. So he really had a huge impact with his books and his advocacy.
Well, one of the things I found in reading about your dad, which is echoed in Seeing Through the Smoke, is this idea of looking at how harmful marijuana is or isn't. And one of the accounts that I came across says that one of the accounts that he came across, which was from a Western scientific perspective, was that in British India, the Brits were concerned that their soldiers were being seduced by marijuana and bang and smoking too much of it. It was obviously harmful and bad for them. And then they did these studies over decades, which found actually not only was it not harmful, but in many cases it was somewhat beneficial.
Absolutely. And, that sort of presages the Schaefer report and the other reports where the government have the LaGuardia report. There have been several reports commissioned by the U.S. government. One, in the 1940s after Anslinger, the LaGuardia report, and then the Schaefer report with Nixon commissioned, which came to similar conclusions. They were sort of intended to show how dangerous cannabis was, to support the whole edifice of prohibition. And they actually ended up showing, again, sort of like my dad concluded, it's not without any harms, no medicine, nothing I prescribe is without any harms. I mean, I can give you penicillin for your strep throat, which is the right thing to do, and you could have a fatal allergy. We just have to decide what is the least harmful option to prescribe. And study after study has shown that cannabis is far less harmful than, and again, not without harms, but far less harmful than it's been portrayed as, mostly by the US government. And then unfortunately, when it used to be illegal in the US in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, and it was a popular medicine, and a couple hundred scientific papers were published about cannabis. And then when they went to criminalize it in 1937, one of the leading voices against criminalization was the American Medical Association. They were completely on board with cannabis. It was never criminalized for medical or health reasons. And then under withering pressure from Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is like the precursor to the DEA, the doctors flip sides. I mean, I sort of joke in my book how they turned "do no harm," our motto, into "be good sheep," because they, in a sheep-like manner, just flip sides. And as my dad explained it, the medical profession for several generations were both victims of and perpetrators of all the misinformation and nonsense from the U.S. government about cannabis, where they'd only fund research into harm and wouldn't fund research into benefits or researchers. So doctors have had a very distorted role in all of this.
Well, one thing you make clear in the book, and also in your recent rejoinder to the New York Times, is that when you turn the serious lens of science on all this stuff, it's pretty clear that Western medicine, Western government, Western business has really gotten this wrong for decades and decades and decades. Your father and Schultes were both beloved on the Harvard campus in the 70s for getting kids off after they were busted for a joint and faced, years and years in prison and a ruined record. Schultes told me that one time he was in court and this kid had got busted for a joint, and he told the defense attorney, ask the policeman what the difference is between cannabis sativa and cannabis sativa L. Of course, L is just the scientific abbreviation for Linnaeus, who described it, so it's the same thing. Well, the policeman came up with some bullshit answer, and the kid got sprung free. But your father's most famous case of getting somebody unjustly accused of wrongdoing for marijuana was John Lennon. Can you talk a bit about that?
Oh, yeah. I've been writing this series of newsletters about my dad. And the first one was about Carl Sagan. The second one was about John Lennon. And the third one was about this crazy trip my dad went on to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, when this poor guy was sentenced to death for using medicinal cannabis. And my dad got him off the hook with Ramsey Clark. So my second newsletter I just wrote was about John Lennon. John Lennon was targeted by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon hated my dad, too. It's a long story, but he called my dad a clown in one of his daily briefings. He circled my dad's name and said, this clown is far to the left. So Richard Nixon was not a huge fan of my dad's, but they were trying to deport John and Yoko because he had supposedly a conviction for cannabis in England. And because you're allowed, back then with the drug war, I don't quite understand the technicalities, but if someone had a drug charge, you were allowed to selectively deport them. So Richard Nixon was trying to deport John and Yoko. And the attorney, Richard Wilds, for John Lennon, sort of got my dad to help testify because John Lennon didn't have marijuana. He had hashish, which was cannabis resin. It wasn't cannabis. And on that technicality, the judge said, this doesn't pertain at all to the law that you're trying to use to deport John Lennon. And John and Yoko got spared deportation and got to remain in this country. It was really exciting. My dad got to go out to dinner with them. They gave my dad a tour of Apple Studios. My older brother, David, of course, has an autographed record from John Lennon. I ended up with nothing, but we won't complain about that today. But no, it was really cool that my dad described John Lennon as just incredibly smart, kind, interesting person, like really, really bright. And then later, when my dad was writing another book, I think it was Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered, my dad wanted to use a John Lennon quote. And I have a copy of this letter where John Lennon sent back the letter that my dad sent him and hand wrote in the bottom, it's okay with me, go ahead and use a quote. And then he circled the quote that my dad wanted to use, which was from the song Tomorrow Never Knows. And John Lennon wrote in, this is from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's this really iconic letter that I have from John Lennon to my dad.
Well, if you're willing to share a copy of that, I'll put it in the show notes because I think a lot of our listeners would get a kick out of that.
I'll put it in the chat right now.
But I want to move back in time, Peter, from the 1960s and 70s to the 1840s. That was a time in which marijuana, cannabis, was an approved medication in the U.S., used for a variety of purposes. What happened after that?
After the 1840s, well, cannabis started to get, they changed the name to marijuana to make it sound more foreign and more scary. Those Mexicans with their loco weed, the marijuana. And, they were, the country was becoming more conservative. There was a deliberate targeted campaign against cannabis. They were basically targeting Mexicans and African-American musicians. There were many of the same, prejudices and concerns and anxieties that they whipped up on the southern border that they're whipping up today. It's really amazing, the historical parallels. And they managed to taint cannabis or marijuana and to get people really, really worried about it. The way they did this is that this guy, Harry Anslinger, who, it's very complicated, but he was the head of the new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And we had just finished alcohol prohibition. There was this huge law enforcement bureaucracy with nothing to do. So Anslinger is like, well, we need a new war on drugs. We've got this army. We just don't have a war. So they picked marijuana. Back then, you couldn't really run a war on drugs as well with cocaine and heroin. They weren't as prominent as they were like during Nixon's time. So he really whipped everybody up against marijuana. And the way he did that is Anslinger was working with certain corporatists and industrialists who really didn't want hemp as an industrial competitor to paper or to petrochemicals. And he was very well aligned with the Hearst media outlets. And they would just promote story after story after story. The transparently racist and just awful nature of this propaganda campaign was just amazing. They'd be publishing these stories about these like white women who would use cannabis with black men, then would become pregnant or have STDs. It was like really preying on like people's worst racist fears. And the main point is that the criminalization of cannabis had nothing to do with health or wellness or safety or whether it's a medicine or not a medicine or how dangerous it was. It was all about racism. And underneath the racism, it was about competing commercial interests and different industry. Then they needed the hemp for World War II. So there's a brief period of like hemp for victory. They like airbrushed hemp back in, then they airbrushed it back out again to be part of the war on drugs again. So hemp has gone sort of back and forth, and now it was legal in the 2018 Farm Bill. So hemp goes back and forth, but it was really not based on anything medically related. Again, if anything, the doctors were very much in favor of keeping it legal and accessible to their patients.
Well, I note that legislatively we passed a law banning hemp in 1937, and when the war broke out, FDR was so freaked out he passed emergency legislation in 1942 to not only make it legal, but to encourage people to start growing it. And what was the center of hemp cultivation? Kentucky. Take that, Mitch McConnell.
Right. Well, I think that's why Mitch McConnell is interested in hemp now. He's been one of the proponents for the Farm Bill. He wants his farmers to have something to grow. But, you know, it's so funny how these politicians can forget just what they said a couple of years ago about the same topic. It really just blows my mind. And how their voters can all forget it as well. It's people with such short memories.
Well, I have one quote from an earlier episode of Plants of the Gods, which sort of sums up this love-hate relationship. George Bush, the former president, was a pilot in World War II. In one of the battles in the Pacific, over an island known as Chichijima, south of Japan, his plane was shot down and he bailed out. Little did he realize that parts of his aircraft engine were lubricated with cannabis hemp oil. 100% of his parachute webbing was made from cannabis. The fire hoses on the ship, as were those in the schools he'd attended, were woven from cannabis hemp. And finally, as he stood on the deck, his shoe stitching were made from hemp fiber as well. Yet he went on to become a crusader against cannabis during the drug war.
Well, yeah, that illustrates the point. I mean, there are many other people that do, like John Bonner was so against cannabis when he was the Republican minority leader, and now he's in the cannabis industry. It's like, how could you flip that completely? It just doesn't make these aha moments they just seem a little bit opportunistic. It's pretty interesting.
Well, history repeats itself. I mean, it's one of the students' facilities. I've been studying cannabis for a long time. And I came across an account of Galen, the physician in ancient Rome, 200 AD, where he talked about they were passing out hemp cakes, which I assume was basically hashish, at a banquet. So I thought this is the first report of marijuana brownies.
No, absolutely. And keep in mind that William Osler, who was the father of modern medicine, he founded Johns Hopkins, and he's like one of these very few icons that we study in medical school. He said in 1915, the cannabis indica is the most effective treatment for a migraine known to man or known to humanity. And I think that's still true, more or less.
We'll talk about cannabis and headaches and pain because you cover this quite a bit in your new book.
Well, yeah, it's funny that we still argue. I argue with other doctors. I mean, I try not to, about whether cannabis helps with pain, because it pretty obviously helps with pain. I mean, that's one of the things in my book. I think there is some areas where we can come to agreement about cannabis. It doesn't have to be completely polarized and fighting all the time. I mean, very few people don't think that it helps with pain, except for some of the, I guess, addiction psychiatrists and some of the pain specialists that don't want to lose their business because they like to do injections, which are more lucrative. I mean, a lot of the history of cannabis comes down to the Upton Sinclair quote. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And, you know, in 2017, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which was from the U.S. government. The U.S. government have not been flower children about cannabis. They've been against it all along, and they crunched 10,000 reports, and they came out with the conclusion that said there's definitive evidence that cannabis works for certain types of pain, especially neuropathic pain, that awful burning pain that we get with like sciatica or paraplegia or diabetes or multiple sclerosis. And there's also conclusive evidence that it helps with the anxiety and the insomnia associated with this type of pain, which makes it much worse. So this argument shouldn't be going on. But then in 2021, the International Association for the Society of Pain, this international pain group, comes out and says, well, there's no evidence that cannabis treats pain, so you better use our injections, which, cost a lot more. And it's just so ridiculous. Anybody who's tried cannabis, there's the anecdotal fallacy, which my dad talked about, whereas if someone has relief from something like cannabis for pain, that story will get more airtime than if they don't get relief. So we can get a sort of distorted view of like an anecdote. It isn't necessarily, the summary of anecdote isn't necessarily proof. But if millions and millions of people are saying the same thing, and if anybody who's used cannabis can tell you, you smoke it and the pain, not only do you feel less pain, but the pain doesn't bother you as much. These pain syndromes like fibromyalgia are very, very difficult to treat. We have very poor pharmaceutical treatments for fibromyalgia. But if you look at these studies, the cannabis helps their level of pain. It helps their perception of pain. It helps blunt how much the pain bothers them so they can focus on other things. It helps their anxiety about the pain. It helps their anticipatory pain. It helps their insomnia because of the pain. And in every single study, their health-related quality of life goes up with cannabis use. So it helps in about 7 different ways. And, when we study randomized controlled trials, we usually tinker with one variable at a time. And the endocannabinoid system, the system of neurons, receptors, and transmitters that cannabis works on, does so many things in the body at once that cannabis helps pain in a variety of different ways. And it just blows my mind that we supposed to still spend time. There are really important things to be arguing about. Like a lot of cannabis advocates think that cannabis cures cancer. We don't know that cannabis cures cancer. It hasn't been shown in humans. That's what we should be arguing about. Does cannabis just help with the symptoms of cancer, the nausea, the anorexia, the trouble eating, the pain, or does cannabis help with the cancer itself like it does in cells, but hasn't been shown to do in humans? There are a lot of really legitimate discussions about cannabis and what it does help and what it doesn't help. And I always get amazed that we're still stuck on, does it help with pain? Of course, does it help with sleep? People take it and fall asleep. What else do you want? It's safer than Ambien. So I just get really amazed at how stuck the discussion gets.
Well, to take a step back from cannabis, I think this whole issue of this is just an anecdote. As an ethnobotanist, one of my indigenous colleagues or teacher will say, well, we use this plant for X. And then somebody in the States will say, well, that's just an antidote, N equals 1. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how science occurs, because you have to start with a hypothesis, right? And if some patient says cannabis or something is good for X, that means you follow it up and study it further. It doesn't mean you dismiss it because that isn't found in the literature.
Right. No, exactly. And I guess it was Carl Sagan that called the anecdote the N of 1 study for exactly that reason. It is a study. It's just a study with one person. And how do you learn that anything works if you don't pay attention to patient stories and then study it? Exactly. That's how the scientific process works. And furthermore, there's other types of evidence. Real world evidence is becoming very in vogue in medicine now, and it's becoming very in vogue with cannabis research because, first of all, cannabis is a very complicated plant, as are many of the other plants that you studied during your career. And it doesn't do just like one thing at once. It does a whole bunch of things at once. Cannabis has 500 different molecules in it, many of which are psychoactive. And again, when you do a randomized control study, you're controlling for one variable. But what if the substance does 10 things at once? Or what if the substance has 500 molecules in it at once? It's very hard to do a randomized control trial. And then what if the substance is impossible to blind? You look at these recent studies of the psychedelics and 98% of people are guessing the blinding. If someone gave me 100 micrograms of LSD versus a placebo, I think I could probably tell the difference having done LSD before. It's not a subtle thing. So I think we need to evolve understanding of what constitutes fair and adequate evidence, and not just, and then it goes back to what my dad talked about in several of his books. I mean, we were using lithium and aspirin before the randomized controlled trial was even invented. And, if we only looked at the harms of aspirin, we'd think this is a toxic medication that causes ulcers and bleeding. And we'd have no idea, if we didn't study the benefits as well, that it could help with stroke, with heart attack, with colonic polyps, with all kinds of things. So you just have to look at the history. And, that's one of the themes of my book. You can't look at the history of science without looking at the social history. And you can't look at the social history without looking at the science. For better or for worse, they're intricately linked together. That's true for all the other psychedelics as well. And you just have to untangle what's true from what certain commercial and governmental entities have wanted everybody to believe is true. And the truth is somewhere always in between. But a lot of it's just been buried and distorted for a whole variety of agendas. And, as my dad said, I'm sure you don't mind me quoting him. He said, there's something very unusual about illegal drugs. If they don't always make the user act irrationally, they can make the non-user act very irrationally. And that's what I found with all of these drugs. It's really amazing.
There's so much to unpack there.
Sorry.
So speaking of your dad, I heard a story that he refused to try marijuana so that it could be completely objective for years and years and years. And in one court case, the attorney, I think the district attorney, tried to draw him out and said, how can you be an expert on this if you've never tried it? And your father, without missing a beat, said, well, I'm also an expert on schizophrenia, and I haven't experienced that either.
Right. And then you follow that up by saying, would I be more an expert or less of an expert if I had tried marijuana? And then the district attorney was completely stumped, because that makes no sense. I mean, of course, you're more of an expert if you tried it, but they've stigmatized it so much. They make it seem like you're crazy and have brain damage if you tried it. So my dad really pressed the guy, like, would it be better if I had or hadn't tried it? And the guy didn't have much to say. So my dad was not a great person to try to tie up in a corner in the courtroom. He was very nimble on his feet.
Apparently that's the case. Well, P.J. O'Rourke, the humorist who passed away a couple of years ago, said, when asked about cannabis, he said, how can I be against the only known drug that gets teenage boys to drive slower?
That's really funny. That's true. In my book on driving, I talk about how if you're drunk, you tend to barrel through the red light. And if you're too stoned, you tend to peacefully stop at the green light, neither of which is great.
Well, there's also a great quote I came across in doing background research for this interview, where it said, if you give 5 guys all the alcohol they want, they'll start a fight. But if you give 5 guys all the cannabis they want, they'll start a band.
That's funny. Or commune. That's what they say. One of the main outcomes of cannabis legalization has been an explosion of jam bands.
Well, I also wanted you to talk a bit more about driving, because you did cover it in your book, and it's so germane to the fact that marijuana has become so ubiquitous. I mean, I go home to my hometown in New Orleans, and you walk through the French Quarter, and you're just engulfed in these clouds of smoke. So we don't want to get too carried away. I think that's very powerful about seeing through the smoke, literally, that you're not making the case, oh, it's a panacea, it's good for everything, can never hurt you, so on and so forth. So talk a little bit about driving, because I think that's particularly germane these days.
Sure. I mean, driving's been something that people have been concerned about as we legalize cannabis. And just because there's no way to detect stoned driving, there is a good way to detect alcohol impaired driving, because the level of intoxication very closely correlates the level of alcohol in your blood. You could do a breathalyzer and see if the person's above and below the legal limit. Now, the legal limit's 80 and you're 79, I guess you get off the hook. And if you're 81, you don't. And it's a little bit arbitrary, because you're obviously not going to be driving that much better if you're 79 than you're 81. But there is a limit that they've decided this is the law. Now, with cannabis, there's no way to detect that. Because for a lot of reasons, it depends how much you use, how often you use it, whether you have tolerance. A medicinal cannabis user using 1 puff twice a day for their chronic pain wouldn't be particularly impaired, yet they might have a high level because they're using it a lot. A college kid who uses it once a month, who gets really, really, really high, wouldn't have that high level because it's fat soluble and they've only used it once, but they'd be completely impaired and completely dangerous to drive. So you can't really tell the impairment from the levels. And we have all these states that have these per se laws where if you have any cannabis in your blood, or your urine, you are deemed impaired and you could lose your license. Now, that's really unfair because the thing about cannabis, it is fat soluble. It has a very, very long half-life. And if you have it in your blood or your urine, that just means that you've used cannabis within the last 2 or 3 weeks, not within the last 2 or 3 minutes, not within the last 2 or 3 hours, but within the last 2 or 3 weeks, which has no bearing whatsoever on whether you're impaired. So we need to stop using these tests completely to try to determine if people are impaired. We don't know how to determine if people are impaired. The drug recognition experts miss it all the time. They miss stoned drivers. About a third of the time they say people who are not stoned or stoned. It makes you even question, like, how impaired can the people be if the drug recognition experts are missing it a third of the time? I always joke about how they should have like people who use cannabis being the drug recognition experts, because they'd be able to tell who's high or not these like policemen who've never used cannabis that have no idea what it does. But the fact is, it is more dangerous to drive under the influence of cannabis than under the influence of nothing. It's about all things considered, all the things I just mentioned considered, about twice is dangerous. Now, drinking at the legal level or just above the legal level is about 10 times more dangerous. So it's a lot safer than driving drunk. Driving stoned is a lot safer, though it is not safe. Harm reduction wise, if we really wanted to prevent deaths, we should be focusing on alcohol because it's 10 times more dangerous. Now, when we see cannabis is about twice as dangerous, that still means it's not ethical. It's not ethical really to do anything that makes you more likely to get into an accident, because you could mow into some random innocent family with little kids. So it's much better to drive not on the influence of anything. However, to give a little context, the twice as dangerous the cannabis is about how dangerous it is to drive under all the other medicines that we tell people not to drive on. Like we say, don't drive on Benadryl, don't drive on gabapentin, don't drive on benzodiazepines like your Valiums, your Ativans, don't drive on your opiates, and don't drive on your sedating antidepressants. They are all about the same as cannabis, about twice as dangerous. And so on the one hand, of course, you shouldn't drive on any of that stuff. On the other hand, do we really want to be arresting people for driving on Benadryl, for driving on a little bit of medicinal cannabis, arresting people for driving on their gabapentin because they have really, really bad backache and can't sit in the car? Or do we want to arrest the person who's like careening down the middle of the street, regardless of whether it's alcohol, cannabis, or gabapentin or Ambien? So I just think there's always been this double standard against cannabis where it gets like hyper focused and people get hyper concerned about it. And that often highlights legitimate concerns that get sort of hyper focused on. So people shouldn't drive stoned, but it's in the same category as all these other medications. It's not in the same category as alcohol, if you ask me.
Okay. Well, I want to wind up with one more question, Peter. Have you seen the movie Fantastic Fungi?
I have heard about it. I haven't seen it yet. I've heard it's absolutely spectacular.
It's spectacular. I just watched it for the third time last night. And the reason it's germane to this interview is Paul Stamets, who's the protagonist, concludes with a story about his mother contracting breast cancer and treating her with turkey tail mushrooms. The reason that I find that germane to our conversation here today is that you have a chapter on cannabinoids and cancer in your book. And the point being that these traditional, non-traditional medicines, I guess that can be considered both, like cannabinoids and mushroom, can do things that we can't do with the currently available medicines. And that's just yet another very important and compelling argument for a rethink of how we're making this available, how we're teaching about it in medical schools, how people should regard these things. My attitude towards cannabis, because I get asked about this all the time, not as much as you probably, is it's like pornography. You don't like it, don't smoke it. Stop trying to tell other people what to do, right? Get your nose out of it. I wouldn't say that about methamphetamine, right? But this idea of reefer madness that goes back to the Chinese who wrote the first accounts of cannabis use 4,000 years ago. One of the first accounts talks about cannabis as liberator of sin. So reefer madness, it didn't just start with Anslinger and those other band of gangsters. So talk about cannabis and cancer since you covered so evocatively in Seeing Through the Smoke.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that cannabis helps with the symptoms of cancer, the pain, the anxiety, the anorexia. That's part of how I got involved in cannabis in the first place. Part was that my dad was such a legendary cannabis scholar, but the other part is my brother Danny, when I was growing up, was fighting an unsuccessful battle with childhood leukemia. And my parents illegally in the early 1970s, right when Nixon was starting his war on drugs, bought my brother Danny cannabis to use. And just witnessing the effect on him when he was using his chemotherapy, when he didn't use cannabis, he'd just be like lying alone in his room, throwing up with a towel over his head. And when he was smoking cannabis, he was able to eat. He was able to strum in his Fender Stratocaster, which gave him a lot of pleasure. And most importantly to us, he was able to play with his little brothers. I mean, there's very few things that are as impactful as witnessing the alleviation of suffering in a close family member. And like I saw that with cannabis when I was a little kid. So I knew from a very early age that cannabis does help this particular type of situation. And with cancer, it can help the symptoms of chemotherapy, the nausea, the vomiting. It can help the pain, the anxiety, the lack of appetite. The thing is, in the petri dish, many different components of cannabis kill cancer very, very effectively. However, there haven't been any human studies showing that cannabis kills cancer. That said, a lot of cannabis advocates use these really strong preparations of cannabis, Rick Simpson oil and what have you, and swear that this has turned back the clock on their cancer. But, I get concerned about this just because it hasn't been shown yet. And also because as a doctor for the last 25 years, it's really amazing how much better we've gotten at treating cancer. Someone had lung cancer when I was in medical school a quarter century ago, they'd be dead in a year or two. Now I have patients that have had lung cancer for 20 years and it's like, oh, remember you had the lung cancer 20 years ago? I mean, people survive these things, not all cancers. So my take is if you have cancer, to treat the cancer, find an oncologist and take advantage of all the modern medical care we have. And then if you have symptoms of either the cancer or the chemotherapy, feel free to use cannabis to make yourself more comfortable. And then in the future, once we have human studies showing that cannabis is an adjunct as the chemotherapy regimens, we can incorporate it. Right now, it doesn't hurt, but it has to be understood as an adjunct, not as a primary treatment for cancer. So I think that people can people that are against cannabis are so loath to accept any of the benefits, and people who are pro-cannabis want to believe, some of them, that it can cure everything. And they believe that any new studies that come out about harms are just the same government propaganda over and over again. But in reality, we all need to know about the harms and we all need to know about the benefits with an open mind so that we could maximize benefit to people and minimize harm. Like I know that alcohol isn't great for me, but I might have a drink now and then. But the only way I could have an informed decision is if I have an accurate understanding of the harms and the benefits. And the same is true with cannabis. And we've got to stop covering up one side or the other. And both sides have got to embrace the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, I have a colleague, Dr. Rob Silver, who's a veterinarian, and he's finishing a book on cannabinoids and mushrooms for treating cancer in dogs.
Oh, cool.
And with very promising results. And I can speak from personal experience because our beloved family dog contracted spleen cancer and wasn't cured, but had another year of a very high-quality life thanks to this combo of medicines. So I think the future is particularly bright in the veterinary field long before it'll be, or maybe hopefully not long before it'll be brighter in the human field as well.
You hear so many stories of people, their dog has this big tumor and they've given up and they're just giving it a whole bunch of CBD to make it more comfortable. And lo and behold, the tumor starts regressing. And the stories are just mind-blowing. And not only that, there's some very credible people that I know that have treated their cancer and with cannabis and it's gotten better. So I'm not dismissing these. I'm just saying, like, as a doctor, you sort of have to have some evidence to go along with it. But there's some very credible people that have claimed this. So I think it's really exciting what the future is going to be show too. We just haven't quite shown it yet. And, it's very important. The government has caused so much mayhem by lying about cannabis. I have people come into my primary care clinic and say, why should I believe you about a COVID vaccine or a tetanus vaccine? The government lied to me about cannabis. Like, once you squander your credibility with like a voter, a patient, or a teenager with the DARE program and telling them these fantastical things about cannabis, it's very hard to get your credibility back. So I tried to stick very, very carefully to what I could evidence in this book. That's why there's so much science in it, because with cannabis, the data is so contradictory. You could paint any story that you want. And I really, really did my best to paint an accurate one.
Well, it goes back to a point you made earlier about aspirin. If you had a headache 400 years ago, you didn't wait 390 years to find out it was prostaglandins that were the key and that it was safe and effective, because everybody was taking it, it was safe and effective. So the fact that we're talking about a plant which has been in widespread use for 5,000 years and probably been in use for 10,000 years, it's a pretty good indication there's something to it. And we just have to get over a few hurdles where there are more studies, it's more widely available, and it's not assumed, and you make this point in the book, it's a panacea for everything and there's nothing harmful can come out of it, so just puff away.
No, absolutely. But, it's really remarkable. Cannabis has been with us for our entire modern human journey. I mean, and it sort of makes sense. It's something that makes us hungry, horny, and more creative and mentally agile would be with us because it gives us a selective advantage. But
jump in here. That should have been the subtitle of your book for marketing purposes.
Okay. A little bit late for that, maybe in the next edition. But the fact that it's been painted as exactly the opposite of this is just so ironic. I was growing up and in my household, there'd be the peace pipe burning with like the most motivational people, like the Allen Ginsbergs, the Carl Sagans, the Richard Schultes, like all having these like brilliant discussions. Of course, I was just a little kid, but I know that much of what was going on, but with the peace pipe burning. And then you go to school and you'd have the same old policeman waddle in year after year and give you the same lecture about cannabis makes you amotivational and dumb. And I'm like, who are the smart people here? Who are the people actually trying to change the world? And who are the people just, parroting the party line? It really was a case study in like what was true and what was not true and how confusing it could be to a teenager when they're lying to you about this stuff in school.
Well, it was people like your father, Schultes, John Lennon, the Grateful Dead, who were really onto something 50 years ago, even if it took us half a century to realize they were right and we were wrong.
Don't forget Andy Weil, and he was there too. And Rick Doblin's been doing this for a long time too. It's all these pictures of my childhood. It's great to see them still chugging away, getting it right, and getting acclaim for all this stuff that they were right about all along.
That's absolutely true. So to conclude, tell me about Raphael Mechoulam, because that's such an interesting story that ties a lot of this together.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, he and my dad were friendly, and he was like the chemist where my dad was like the psychiatrist and the activist for cannabis. Raphael Mechoulam, like my dad, has worked on, he passed away just a couple months ago, where my dad passed away a couple years ago. Rafi was a Israeli organic chemist who discovered THC. He was studying it in Israel because there wasn't the same moral panic. There wasn't the same drug war that we had, and he had access to it. It's really funny. I know this movie about him that we had discussed before the show. It's a really cute movie. He just asked the Israeli police for some hashish to study. He's like, "Hey, I'm a chemist. Can I have some hashish?" They're like, "Sure. We just confiscated this great Lebanese hashish. Here it is." And he just decomposed it into the different components. And they didn't know any of the cannabinoids back then. They didn't know anything about it, except that if you smoke marijuana, you get high. They didn't know which of the many compounds. So he separated it into his different compounds and then pumped it in to this family of monkeys one by one. And one of them got them really high. And then he's like, aha, this is THC. It's just a very funny story how he did this. But he had been working on cannabis for literally the last 50 years. And he has so many incredible discoveries. And he is, I don't want to say single-handedly because many other brilliant people contributed, but he was like the force that kept the research going to the point where they actually discovered and delineated the endocannabinoid system, which is so important to many, many processes in our body. And, he would have easily gotten the Nobel Prize if it were any other topic but cannabis, because he pushed our knowledge from zero to the incredible explosion of knowledge that we're having today with like thousands of researchers all over the world studying the endocannabinoid system. So I think he's a true hero in the scientific world, and he's going to be getting more and more acclaim as we reclaim cannabis as part of our, mainstream medical practice.
Well, one of the points I tried to make with this Plants of the Gods series is how many good things come out of these plants and the studies of these plants that have nothing to do with mind-altering states. And it was Mechoulam's work which helped unlock the secret of receptors, which is fundamental to our understanding of just about everything. So this, again, wasn't about getting high. This is about science, and it was that combination of nature and traditional use in science that helped us unlock doors which I think will continue to yield many results for the foreseeable, even in the unforeseeable future as well.
Absolutely. And doors that need to still be kicked open because they only teach the endocannabinoid system in about 13% of medical schools. I mean, even if you're against cannabis and you think it's the satanic weed, you should understand the endocannabinoid system so you understand why it's so harmful. I mean, it's absolutely amazing they're not teaching it in medical schools. We still have so many hangovers from the war on drugs. It's going to take quite a while to dig out of it. And it's interesting to see, this would be a whole nother conversation, but the psychedelics have gone from being bad drugs to good drugs so quickly in the minds of like the mainstream psychiatric community. That's going to be a recipe for mischief.
That's for sure. Well, look, I can do this for hours, but let's just consider this chapter 1. And
looking forward to chapter 2. Absolutely.
Yeah, but let's stay in touch on this, and we'll talk more.
Absolutely. And I owe you, I will send you this letter from John Lennon shortly after the show.
I will put it in the show notes, and I will use it to cross-promote this far and wide in the rock community and elsewhere.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to chat with you. I look forward to the time we get to chat in person.
I look forward to that as well.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. Stay tuned for Season 5 of Plants of the Gods later this year.